Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I can still smell the desert air, thick with dust and the faint trace of sagebrush. It's a scent that's etched into my memory, as sharp and pungent as the terror that gripped me that night. I was just a kid, barely 13, and my father had been teaching me the ways of hunting, tracking, patience, the quiet reverence of the desert. He was a seasoned hunter, his skin tanned dark from years in the sun, his eyes always watching, always alert. He had warned me about things that roamed the desert, things I didn't believe in, skinwalkers. The stories always seemed like the kind of folklore you hear to scare children, things to keep you from wandering too far from the campfire. But that night, everything changed. We were out in the wilds of New Mexico, tracking deer. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the desert had taken on that eerie stillness that makes your skin prickle. The air was cold now, the kind of cold that sneaks up on you, making you shiver even though the ground beneath you is still warm. My father led the way, his boots kicking up clouds of dust as we moved quietly through the sparse brush. I'd lost all sense of time, my mind wrapped up in the rhythm of our steps, the crunch of earth beneath our feet, and the far-off howl of coyotes. Then we saw it. At first, I thought it was a mirage, the heat of the desert playing tricks on me. A figure standing near a dried-up creek bed. It looked like a man, but something was wrong. The shape was tall, almost too tall, and its skin wasn't human. It looked cracked, like the bark of an old, dying tree, pale and leathery. The texture wasn't flesh. It was more like something that had been left to rot in the sun for too long. And its eyes, God, its eyes, they glinted in the moonlight like the eyes of an animal, wild and hungry. It was staring right at us. I felt my father freeze beside me, his breath catching in his throat. His face went pale, ashen, the color drained from his skin. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the figure. Then, in a voice so low it was barely a whisper, he said, "Don't move." I didn't need to be told twice. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they were made of stone. My father's eyes didn't leave the creature. It began to twitch like a sudden spasm, and I could see it shifting, changing shape. The figure bent unnaturally, its bones cracking, twisting as it lowered its body to the ground. In the blink of an eye, it wasn't a man anymore. It was a coyote, but not a regular coyote. Its fur was matted and dark, its eyes still those unnatural, gleaming pools of malice. The thing stared at us for what seemed like hours, though I know it was only a few seconds. My father yanked me by the arm, and we took off running, faster than I've ever run in my life. The sound of paws on the earth echoed behind us, the coyote moving at a speed that was unnatural, almost too fast to believe. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. We neared the truck. Just ahead, the headlights cutting through the dark like a beacon of safety. I looked back, expecting the coyote to be right behind us, but it was gone. For a brief, impossible moment, I thought maybe we had escaped. Maybe it was over. But then I saw it, The creature had shifted again, and this time it wasn't a coyote. It was standing in front of us, a shape I couldn't recognize. But the worst part was the face. The face of the thing was my father's. His eyes, those eyes I had trusted for my whole life, stared at me from the figure's twisted form. His mouth moved, but the words weren't his. The voice was wrong, hollow, empty, like it was being dragged out of the earth. "Run, son," it whispered, but I knew it wasn't him. It was the Skinwalker. It had taken his shape. The thing that had stolen my father's face was something else, something monstrous. I screamed for him to run, but it was too late. I watched in horror as the figure of my father, my real father, vanished into the night, leaving nothing but the sound of wind and the eerie silence of the desert. The next day, when the sun had risen and the desert was nothing but an endless stretch of sand, I found his jacket lying in the dirt. It was still warm from the heat of his body, but there was no sign of him. No blood, no tracks, just the empty desert, as if he had never been there at all. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand it. But I do know this. Skinwalkers aren't just stories. And the desert, it has a way of swallowing people whole. To this day, I hear the coyotes howling in the distance, and sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I hear my father's voice calling my name. But when I turn around, there's nothing there. Nothing but the desert and the dark. Story 2. It was supposed to be one of those camping trips you tell your kids about. The kind of trip where everything goes right. The kind of trip that leaves you with nothing but good memories and stories to share around the fire for years to come. My friends and I were tired of the city, tired of the noise, the traffic, the constant buzz of life that never seemed to let up. We just wanted some peace, something real. So, we decided to head out to the forests of Montana, far from civilization, deep into the woods. We set up our tents by a small creek that ran through the trees. The sound of the water was soothing, almost like a lullaby, and as we settled down, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. The night air was cool but refreshing, and we spent hours laughing and talking, watching the stars blink down at us from above. For a while, it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. By midnight, most of us had turned in, the cold air making it hard to stay awake for much longer. I stepped outside to relieve myself, figuring I'd be quick and get back to the warmth of my sleeping bag. The night was still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has gone to sleep too. But as I stood there, the hair on the back of my neck began to rise. Something wasn't right. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but then I saw them, two glowing eyes in the distance, just beyond the trees. They were small at first, like the reflection of headlights from a car far away. But as I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, I realized something. They were moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. I squinted, trying to make out the shape of whatever creature was behind those eyes. Maybe a deer, I thought. Deer eyes glow in the dark. But these didn't blink. Deer blink. These eyes didn't. They just stared. And that's when I felt it. An icy chill that ran down my spine. A sensation I hadn't felt before. I stood frozen, not sure whether I should turn and run or wait it out. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was glued to the spot, unable to look away. The eyes grew larger as they came closer, and the shadow of a figure started to take shape in the darkness. A man, or at least, that's what I thought at first. He was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed almost too long for his body. His hair hung down in matted clumps, the kind of long hair that looked like it hadn't been touched by a comb in years. His clothes were old, worn, torn at the edges, as though he'd been living in the woods for far too long. But it wasn't just his appearance that made my heart race. It was the way he moved. Slow, jerky, like he was struggling to hold himself together. My gut told me something was horribly wrong, but I couldn't look away. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my body was paralyzed, stuck in place like some cruel joke. Then he spoke. At least, I thought he spoke. But it wasn't words. It wasn't language. It was like a low growl, a rumbling sound from deep within his chest. It didn't sound human. Nothing about him sounded human. The figure took a step forward, and then another. With every step, his shape began to twist, to bend, to stretch, as if the very air around him was being pulled into something else. Something that was no longer a man. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. My heart pounded in my chest, the thumping loud enough to drown out everything else. And then the air grew cold. I mean freezing cold. The kind of cold that feels like it's inside you, in your bones. And the smell, God, the smell, it was unbearable. It smelled like something was rotting, decaying in the dark, the kind of stench that makes you gag and choke. It was so overwhelming that I thought I might pass out from it. The figure before me was no longer human. It was a creature, its body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Fur began to sprout from its skin, black and matted, like the kind of fur you'd see on a wolf. But this wasn't a wolf. No, this was something else, something far worse. It was a skinwalker. I could feel the cold, wet ground beneath my feet, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore except the thing standing before me, its eyes still glowing, burning into my soul. Its mouth twisted into something that almost resembled a smile. And then it did something I can't forget. It spoke, but it didn't speak with its own voice. No, it spoke with my father's voice, a low, gravelly whisper calling my name. Come closer, son. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran like I've never run before. I bolted for the tent, heart pounding in my ears, legs moving faster than I thought they could. I heard the thing behind me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, but when I glanced back, it was gone. There was nothing there. I dove into the tent, waking my friends, telling them everything, but they didn't believe me. They thought I'd had a nightmare, but I knew what I saw. I knew what it was. The thing, whatever it was, wanted me. I've never been back to those woods, and I never will, because once you've been watched by something like that, you can never unsee it. And you can never forget the way it made you feel. Like you were nothing more than prey in a world where you don't belong. Story 3. We thought we'd be fine. That's the thing about winter in the Adirondacks. You plan for the worst, but you never really expect it. My 3 friends and I were holed up in a remote cabin, a little off the beaten path, with enough supplies to last us a few days. The kind of place you go when you want to disconnect. No phones, no distractions, just the thick, quiet snow and the cold, biting wind. It started like any other snowstorm. The skies darkened, the wind picked up, and the snow began to fall, thick and fast, as if the heavens themselves had opened. By the time the storm hit, we knew we wouldn't be able to leave until it passed. We settled in, playing cards, telling stories, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that started creeping in with the storm. That's when it began, the scratching. At first, we thought it was the wind, the snow lashing against the walls, but there was something too deliberate about it, too rhythmic, too persistent. It wasn't random, like the storm outside. No, this was someone purposeful. At first, we all ignored it. No one wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Bears. It was a bear, maybe a raccoon. Jack, the level-headed one in our group, made a move to the window and peeked out, rifle in hand. He didn't say a word, just stared into the blizzard, his face hardening with every second that passed. But the scratching continued, growing louder, closer. Then it happened. The smell. It was faint at first, a sour, rotten scent that lingered just beyond the edge of your awareness. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew, like a thick fog creeping into the cabin. The smell of death, like something had died nearby. No, not nearby. Inside. I couldn't help it. I gagged, choking on the rancid air. What is that? My voice sounded far too loud in the silence that followed. Jack's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear. Stay inside, he muttered, his hand gripping the rifle tighter. Stay away from the windows. We don't know what we're dealing with. We huddled together in the main room, the heat from the fire doing nothing to shake the chill that had crept into our bones. The walls felt like they were closing in on us, the silence suffocating. I could feel my heart racing, thumping painfully against my ribs. The scratching had stopped, but the smell remained, hanging in the air like a thick, oppressive fog. And then, the door, our only exit, slammed open with a deafening crash. The wind howled in, bitter and cold, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. No, what froze me in place was the thing standing in the doorway. It was tall, unnaturally tall, like it had been stretched. Its skin was stretched too, tight over its bones like some kind of grotesque marionette. Frost clung to its body, turning its skin an unnatural, ghostly white. But the worst part? Its eyes. Those eyes. Huge, hollow, and wild with hunger. The creature stared at us, its gaze unblinking, its pupils wide and black, as though it were a predator sizing up its prey. And for a moment, it just watched us, unblinking, unfeeling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the creature had frozen me in place with just that look. Then it grinned. Its lips peeled back slowly, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged to belong to anything human. The grin stretched wider, exposing the empty, cavernous maw beneath. It was a smile that could only mean one thing: hunger. You're mine now, it growled, its voice deep and guttural, like a dying animal's last breath. I could feel the words vibrating in my chest, heavy and sickening. I don't know how, but we all backed away from the door, inching towards the farthest corner of the room. Jack, his face pale, slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't stay in that cabin, and we couldn't leave. The storm outside was a wall of white, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't just going to walk away. It had us. The hours stretched on, and all we could do was sit in silence, our eyes fixed on the door, every sound in the night seeming to come from it. We didn't sleep. We didn't move. We just waited. The storm raged on outside, but the wind had died down by the time morning came. When the light finally broke through the clouds, we dared to step outside. That's when we saw it. There was blood on the doorstep, dark crimson staining the snow, and 2 of our group were gone, vanished. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. Just blood, and the unmistakable claw marks, long, deep gouges in the snow, too wide to be made by anything natural. We searched the area, but it was all in vain. The Wendigo had claimed them. We never spoke of that night again. Some things are too dark to talk about. But as I sit here, years later, I still feel it. That cold, that hunger, the feeling that no matter how far you run, no matter how much you pray, that thing in the snowstorm is still out there, watching, waiting. And you? You're already too far gone. Story 4. I'd always heard the stories. The kind that make the hairs on your neck stand up. The kind that make you glance over your shoulder when you're alone. Wendigo stories. People told them around campfires, on the rare occasions when they dared to enter the deep Michigan woods. But I, a hunter with more seasons under my boots than I care to admit, always laughed it off. I figured I was above it. I thought I knew better, but that was my mistake. It all started on a crisp autumn day, the kind of day that felt like the world was holding its breath. The leaves were turning orange and gold. The air smelled like pine and earth. Perfect hunting weather. I'd been tracking a buck for hours, trekking deeper into the woods than I had any right to. But that's what hunters do. We chase the silence. We seek it. By sunset, I had finished setting the last of my traps. The forest was calm, too calm. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the quiet hum of wind weaving through the trees. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a low, eerie cry. It could have been an animal, maybe a fox or a wounded deer. But there was something about it that didn't sit right. It wasn't the usual sound. It was a mix of a human scream, raw and desperate, and an animal's howl, twisted and guttural. My pulse picked up, but I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks, the forest bending reality like it tends to do at dusk. I kept walking, shaking off the unease that settled in my stomach. I should have known then. I should have turned around, packed up, and made my way back to the cabin. But curiosity, the kind of dangerous curiosity that hunters like me are cursed with, pulled me forward. The cry came again, louder this time, more desperate. I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on my arms were standing on end. I could feel it in my bones. Something wasn't right. But I ignored that instinct. I told myself it was just a hiker, maybe someone lost, maybe just an injured animal. So I kept going, my steps heavy on the damp earth. As I neared the clearing, the sound came again, and this time it didn't feel like it was coming from the woods. It felt like it was coming from the ground beneath me, from the very trees themselves. I stepped into the clearing, and there it was. At first, I thought it was a person, but it wasn't. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stood in the middle of the clearing. Its skin was stretched tight over bones, a grotesque parody of a human form. The moonlight caught the edges of its body, making the thin, leathery skin shimmer, like it was somehow alive, but not. Its face was a mask of death, pale, gaunt, with eyes that didn't blink, didn't move. It stared straight at me, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. Then it turned its head, slowly, impossibly slowly, and that's when I saw its mouth. It was too wide. Its lips stretched back to reveal rows and rows of jagged, yellow teeth. It grinned at me, a grin that wasn't meant for anyone alive. But the worst part, the eyes. They weren't human. They weren't anything I'd ever seen before. They were hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out whatever soul it had once held. It was like staring into the darkness of the universe itself. Cold, void, nothing. I couldn't move. My body froze, like the forest had reached inside me and locked my muscles in place. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't breathe. And then it spoke. It wasn't words, not like we understand words, but I heard it in my head, deep in my skull. A voice so cold it made the air around me freeze. You shouldn't have come. That's all it said. I didn't wait to hear anything else. My feet were moving before my brain could catch up. I ran. I don't remember the first few steps, but I remember the ground shifting beneath me, the branches whipping at my face. I didn't look back, not once. The sound of its breath, ragged and uneven, followed me like a shadow, getting closer with every step. By the time I reached my cabin, I was gasping for air, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. I slammed the door behind me, locked every bolt, and sank to the floor, trembling. But the worst part? That cry, the one I'd heard in the woods, the one that had drawn me in, it never stopped. Even after I locked myself inside, even after I made sure every window was secure, it kept coming. That hollow, desperate scream, a mix of human and beast, would echo through the trees every night for days. It never followed me in, but I knew it was still out there, waiting, and it wasn't just a story anymore.